Resident Evil is widely regarded as the series that brought life to zombies in video games. No pun intended, but also pun completely intended. There's been an endless amount of media made for the series, including video games, movies, comic books, novels, you name it, Resident Evil has most likely done it. The two most recent entries, Resident Evils 5 and 6, changed their direction and didn't play to the series' horror elements, but Capcom is hoping to change that with its new entry into the series, Resident Evil 7. Hi, I'm Jacob from the Leaderboard, and we're here to give you a history on your favorite zombie fighting series. So grab an axe, mix some antidotes, sell some stuff to a weird guy in a trench coat, and get ready for 107 facts about Resident Evil. Let's get started. Fact number 1. The first Resident Evil game, also known as Biohazard depending on who you ask, started development in 1993. It ultimately took 3 years to finish development. Number 2. The first game in the series was actually meant to serve as a remake, not an original title. Capcom initially wanted it as a reboot to one of their NES titles, Sweet Home, which was based on a Japanese horror movie of the same name. Number 3. Sweet Home was a blend of both horror and RPG genres. It had a unique element where the main characters could suffer from permadeath and some characters were needed to get through certain parts. The game itself had 5 different endings and would vary based on who survived throughout the game. Number 4. Shinji Mikami was chosen to helm the creation of Resident Evil and to develop the game. The initial project was proposed by the creator of Sweet Home, I'm so sorry about some of these pronunciations, Tokuro Fujiwara, who Mikami viewed as a mentor. Number 5. Capcom wanted to make Resident Evil because they saw the potential of the PlayStation system. It was one of the first transitions for games going from 2D to 3D, and Capcom believed that it could add a whole new level of horror if games were in 3D. And they were right. Number 6. Although Capcom had confidence in the game being made, they didn't give developers any extra time or special treatment. The game itself was an uphill battle to create and was only made possible by random employees helping on their free time and Mikami's dedication to get the game done. Number 7. Yasuhiro Ampo, one of the original programmers that worked on Resident Evil, remembers the game being a whirlwind process. He recalls that the staff constantly changed and the most developers they had at one point was 80. There was also no quality control type of testing, so all the debugging was done internally by what the developers found while the game was still being developed. Number 8. It may have been a difficult development cycle, but the one who took the brunt of it was Mikami himself. At the beginning of the project, the first 6 months of development were actually a solo project because Mikami was doing almost everything by himself. Number 9. The first 6 months allowed Mikami to develop a lot of the creative end of the game. He spent the time creating character designs, concept sketches, and wrote an original draft of the script that was 40 pages long. Number 10. Mikami had his own worries on whether or not the game would sell. It wasn't because it was a somewhat new genre of video games, but rather he was worried it wouldn't do anything new. He wanted the sense of killing a zombie and fighting for your life in the game to feel like something the player had never experienced before. Number 11. Resident Evil took on a lot of influences from different forms of media, be it films or other video games, but 2 core concepts of the game were set in stone. The idea of the single setting of the manor and the static camera angles. The primary reasons for these choices were the technical limitations of 3D environments at the time, but it allowed Mikami to experiment with the game in a way that had never been seen before. Number 12. Ampo recalls that they had to use polygons in the game sparingly due to technical limitations. That's when Mikami made the decision to have all the backgrounds be pre-rendered and save the polygons for all the zombies that wanted to eat your brains. Number 13. The wall backdrops were heavily inspired by one horror film in particular, The Shining. It's often cited that Mikami was heavily influenced by The Shining when it came to designing the environments for the rooms in Resident Evil. Number 14. Both Ampo and Mikami have mixed feelings and memories on the overall legacy that the first Resident Evil ultimately created. Ampo expressed that he was happy to work on the game and that the intense development cycle is reflective on how indie development is now. Mikami believed the game would never turn into a series because horror has a specific pattern, and if it keeps showing up in other games, then players will get tired of it. He often reflects on how his life would have turned out had he continued as a creative director and not a producer, but ultimately he still feels extremely fortunate with what the Resident Evil series has brought to his life. Number 15. The beginning of the game has the player choose between using either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. However, early beta screenshots reveal that co-op was an idea that was considered for the game, but ultimately didn't make the cut. Number 16. All of the live-action videos that serve as cutscenes were filmed in Japan. However, the actors that appear in the videos are all American. Number 17. 13. Fujiwara, who served as a producer for the game, projected that it would only sell about 200,000 copies because he believed the game only targeted a core audience. The original game would go on to sell well over 1 million copies. Number 18. Mikami always had the idea of multiple endings for the game because he wanted the game to feel unique. He wanted players to live their own storyline through their experiences and felt if the game was just a pre-packaged experience, then people wouldn't have as great of a memory of their time playing it. Number 19. The reason behind the title change from Biohazard to Resident Evil was due to copyright reasons. Chris Kramer, the director of communications at Capcom, knew it would be impossible to copyright Biohazard in the United States because of another flop game with the same title, as well as a New York-based band with the same name. So, Capcom held an internal company contest to think of a new title. Everyone loved the title Resident Evil, except for Kramer, who thought it was a lame title. He ultimately went with the team's choice since they loved it so much. The guy's a team player. Number 20. The game went through a strict cutting room process to make its way from Japan to the United States. A lot of the game's intro was cut due to violence, and even a scene where Chris is seen smoking was cut out. When the game was released in the US, it became one of the first titles on the PlayStation to garner an M rating from the ESRB. Number 21. Once the game was released in 1996, it was beloved by fans and critics throughout the world. It currently holds a 91 Metascore, and many critics praised it for feeling like a true interactive movie, doing things no other games had done before. Number 22. The original game was remastered in 2015 and was released on the PS4 and Xbox One. There have been several ports of the original game since its initial release that range all the way from the Sega Saturn to the previously mentioned remasters. Number 23. One of the biggest ports came to the GameCube, which completely changed the feel of the game. It was an astounding graphic overhaul and changed the entire atmosphere of how it played. Number 24. If you beat the invisible mode in the Resident Evil remake in under 5 hours, you will unlock a message from the man himself, Shinji Mikami. Number 25. Resident Evil went on to get a sequel, but the path to get the second game made was a bit of a headache. It was originally going to be called Resident Evil 1.5, and Mikami wanted it to be the end of the series. However, Fujiwara disagreed with the ending and wanted the game to serve as a bridge to a meta-series and go on to expand the Resident Evil lore. Number 26. Resident Evil 1.5 ultimately got scrapped, and only some of its original features actually made it to Resident Evil 2. The sequel came out in 1998 and had 2 new heroes to choose from, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. Number 27. One of the biggest changes that Resident Evil 2 brought was a change of locations. Players were no longer limited to one location and instead could discover more layers of Raccoon City and figure out the mysteries surrounding it. Number 28. The game also expanded on character selection. Depending on who you choose in Resident Evil 2, the player will face different puzzles and environments that are exclusive to the character chosen. Number 29. The game's difficulty was changed in the US to be harder than it was in Japan. The reason was that Capcom didn't want rentals of the game to bring down the overall sales. If the game was more difficult, it would force players to end up buying the game. Number 30. Resident Evil 2 also featured more violent game over screens in the US. Capcom had more freedom in terms of censorship for the sequel in America, which allowed the game over screen to actually be more violent than it is in Japan. Number 31. Despite its multiple delays and rocky development cycle, Resident Evil 2 ended up being an instant hit for Capcom. The game currently holds an 89 on Metacritic and was widely regarded as a true sequel that improves everything its predecessor did before it. Number 32. Resident Evil 2 became one of the best single-platform games ever for the PlayStation 1. It went on to sell close to 5 million copies in its lifetime on the PlayStation. Number 33. Resident Evil 2 went on to be ported to different consoles and even came back to the PlayStation 1. A new version of the game, called the DualShock version, added support for the new DualShock controllers that brought vibration and 2 joysticks to the PlayStation controller. It also had 2 CD-ROMs for the game, rather than just 1. Number 34. Resident Evil 2 was ported over to the Sega Dreamcast, rest in peace you beautiful machine, and got added features as well. One of the most notable features was that the game utilized the Dreamcast's VMU, or Virtual Memory Unit, which was an add-on for the controller that had a small screen. The game would display the player's current health and ammo without having to go into the inventory screen. Number 35. For the Nintendo 64, Capcom was able to make an impressive port of Resident Evil 2. The N64 was never known for having CG cutscenes due to its limited storage on a cartridge, but all of the CG videos are intact on the N64 version, though they are heavily compressed. Regardless, Resident Evil 2 remains one of the few N64 games to have an extensive amount of CG cutscenes. Number 36. In Resident Evil 2, the A-scenario player passes by a store on Flower Street called Aruka's. This is Sakura spelled backwards, which is a reference to Sakura Kasugano, a character in Capcom's Street Fighter series. Number 37. Resident Evil 1 and 2 will always have a long-standing legacy, and both games ushered in the horror genre to video games in a way that had not been done before. Their releases paved the way for game series like Silent Hill, Parasite Eve, and Dino Crisis to be made. Number 38. Capcom wasted no time when it came to the development of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, which was released just a year after Resident Evil 2. It was produced by Mikami and led by Hideki Kamiya, who was one of the original producers on Resident Evil 1. Number 39. The reason development was so short for Resident Evil 3 was because Capcom had been developing multiple spin-offs for the Resident Evil series, and Nemesis happened to be one of them. So, instead of being a spin-off, the team actually developed it as the third installment to the series. Number 40. The primary reason Capcom wanted the game out so quickly was because the PlayStation 2 would be launched only a year and a half after Resident Evil 3 would be released. Capcom wanted to add at least one more entry into the series on the PlayStation before making the jump to the PS2. Number 41. In Resident Evil 3, players take the helm of Jill Valentine and continue to explore the outbreak happening in Raccoon City. However, there are multiple elements in the game that hint toward what would come next in the series. Number 42. One of the newest additions to Resident Evil 3 was the concept of Nemesis himself, who is an ultra-zombie sporting a giant rocket launcher. Nemesis stalks the player throughout the game, and the player has the option to either fight him head-on or to run away entirely. This gave the game a series of heightened pace and action that had not yet been seen in the series. Number 43. One of the biggest inspirations for Resident Evil 3 came from Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Nemesis himself was inspired by the villain of the film, the liquid metal T-1000. Mikami wanted the players to feel as though they were being constantly stalked by an impending force. Number 44. In terms of combat, the game felt more fast-paced overall. There was an introduction of a full 180-degree turn, and players could also dodge attacks with a dedicated dodge move. Number 45. The game ended up being a solid entry into the series and was met with favorable reviews. It currently holds a 79 Metacritic score. Number 46. Resident Evil Code Veronica was officially announced in 1998 and would usher in something completely new to the franchise. It would be the first installment in the series to not be on a PlayStation console at first. Rather, it would launch on the Sega Dreamcast. Number 47. Although there is no number at the end of Resident Evil Code Veronica, it is meant to serve as a true entry into the main storyline. Project supervisor Yoshiki Okamoto has even stated that he believes Code Veronica is the true follow-up to Resident Evil 2. Number 48. One of the biggest changes that came with the switch to the Dreamcast was the technology now available to the developers. It was the first game in the series to feature full CG rendered backgrounds. No more static backgrounds when you're rocking the power of the Dreamcast. Rest in peace, you beautiful machine. Number 49. The game was met with very favorable reviews for its technical prowess, with a metascore of 84. However, reviews cited how similar it felt to Resident Evil 3, which makes sense since it was being developed at the same time. It was also criticized for not really expanding on the overall story of Resident Evil. Number 50. Code Veronica may not have felt as unique as it could have, but it did feature special elements that would become a staple of the Resident Evil series. It had some of the silliest cutscenes in the series that hinted at how outlandish some of the stories would end up being in the Resident Evil franchise. Number 51. Resident Evil 0 was the next installment in the Resident Evil series. It served as a prequel to the original game, and it lets us play as Rebecca Chambers, who was in the first Resident Evil, and Billy Cohen, an all-new character introduced in the game. Number 52. One of the key features that the team wanted to include was the partner zapping system from Resident Evil 2. It allows the players to switch between the two characters at any given time and for certain puzzles or situations to be resolved. Number 53. The game was meant to launch on the Nintendo 64 since the cartridge-based system allowed for minimal load times, which made the partner zapping system work well. However, due to storage issues and graphic limitations, the N64 project was scrapped and the prequel eventually ended up on the GameCube shortly after the original Resident Evil remake. Number 54. Resident Evil 0 was well regarded among critics on a technical level for giving players a sense of immersion that had not yet been felt in previous Resident Evil games. It currently holds an 83 score on Metacritic. Number 55. Regardless of the positive reviews, many fans felt the game's stories didn't do much to add to the overall Resident Evil experience. This led to poor sales for both Resident Evil 0 and the remake of Resident Evil, which forced Capcom to make changes to the series. Number 56. Resident Evil 4's history starts as early as 1999. The game's development was first hinted at during Capcom's Gamers Day, when it was mentioned that Mikami was working on multiple Resident Evil sequels on the PS2. Number 57. Resident Evil 4 ended up having the most intensive development cycle that the series had seen up until this point. The official announcement came in 2000 2002 from a conference held by Capcom, but at that point a version had already been developed and scrapped altogether. Number 58. The first version of Resident Evil 4 is commonly known as the Fog version, which showed Leon Kennedy invading some type of fortress and struggling to survive in this foggy environment. Number 59. This version of Resident Evil 4 was directed by Hiroshi Shibata at the request of Mikami. The gameplay shown as the Fog version was part of a project that was nearly 40% done at the time of its announcement. Number 60. At 2003's E3, Mikami showcased a new version of the game. This version showed Leon trying to fend off some type of infection and having visions of a man with a hook, infamously now called the Hookman, who ends up haunting and stalking Leon. This was meant to give a similar feeling to that of Nemesis in Resident Evil 3. Number 61. During the E3 presentation, Mikami felt confident in this version of the game. Before the trailer began to play, he even urged the audience to not pee their pants. Number 62. Despite Mikami's excitement at E3, he still wasn't happy with how the game felt. He thought it needed something new and exciting to bring fans back to the series. The biggest choice he made came in 2004, and that was to have the camera be behind Leon rather than be a static angle at all times. Number 63. This new version of Resident Evil 4 was shown in March of 2004, and fans were baffled. Not only did the footage show the camera angle from behind Leon, but the Hookman was completely gone. Leon was instead fighting what appeared to be possessed village people, not zombies. This version led to Mikami officially going back to being the creative director of Resident Evil and not just a producer. Number 64. In January of 2005, Resident Evil 4 was released and changed the scope of the series entirely. From the opening moments, players knew this wasn't a traditional Resident Evil by any means. There was an entirely new aiming mechanic which allowed Leon to shoot enemies in the knees and roundhouse kick them. Number 65. The new features didn't just stop at roundhouse kicks, although why would you need anything else? The enemy AI itself had been completely revamped since the enemies weren't zombies but actual people. This allowed them to climb up ladders to follow you, carry weapons, and run after you. Some of the most infamous enemies in the game are the chainsaw-wielding villagers, which instilled immediate fear into any player once they heard that chainsaw rev up. Number 66. The game blew everyone's expectations out of the water and was nominated for pretty much every award possible in the industry. It currently holds a staggering 96 score on Metacritic, with the lowest review being an 88. Number 67. Despite its near-perfect scores, the sales were only okay for the GameCube release at about 1.6 million sales. However, across all of its ports, Resident Evil 4 went on to sell over 7 million units, the most being from PlayStation 2 sales. Number 68. In July of 2005, Capcom officially announced the follow-up to Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5. The first announcement came from an official Capcom statement but had zero details on the game aside from the fact that it was in development, the heartless teases. Number 69. Jun Takeuchi, who served as a producer for Capcom's Lost Planet and Onimusha 3, helmed the Resident Evil 5 project. This was the first major entry into the Resident Evil series without Mikami directly involved in any way. Number 70. Takeuchi felt confident in the way the game looked after they showed off the first trailer for the game. He also wanted the game's story to focus on the main Resident Evil storyline and not feel like a standalone story in the way Resident Evil 4 felt. Number 71. Resident Evil 5 was the first game to come to the next generation of consoles, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Takeuchi wanted to make sure that the game took full advantage of the new technological features and cited that Half-Life 2 was one of the bigger inspirations during his design of Resident Evil 5. Number 72. Takeuchi said that the overall development of Resident Evil 5 took about 4 years to finish. The first year was dedicated to staging and writing, while the next 3 years actually saw the development of the game. Number 73. Resident Evil 5 was also the first game in the series to feature co-op, which was a huge change in every way possible. Previous games had a second character on screen that was controlled by AI, but this was the first game to have a dedicated co-op experience both online and off. Number 74. There's actually a way to have Resident Evil 5 go back to the old camera angle from the original game. At the beginning of the Lost in Nightmares DLC, if you turn around and activate the prompt on the front door, and do this twice, a question mark will appear. If you activate that, the game will go into the classic fixed camera mode. Number 75. Takeuchi's reasoning for adding co-op was because he wanted to keep refreshing the series the way Resident Evil 4 did. He believed that adding co-op would bring a whole new dimension to a Resident Evil game that had not been done before, the same way moving the camera behind the main character did for Resident Evil 4. Number 76. A demo for the game was released in January 2009 for the Xbox 360 and in February 2009 for the PS3. In its first first 3 days alone on Xbox Live, the demo was downloaded over 1.3 million times and would go on to be downloaded over 4 million times across both platforms. Number 77. Resident Evil 5 was officially released on March 13th, 2009. Both Xbox and PlayStation fans were able to get exclusive experiences and products for their respective consoles. Number 78. On the Xbox side, Capcom and Microsoft released a limited edition Red Xbox 360 that came with a copy of the game and a voucher to download Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix, which was awesome. Number 79. The PlayStation fans got a PlayStation Home experience. Oh. If the fans decided to log into PlayStation Home, they could go to the Resident Evil 5 lot, which featured the setting of the game, and players could buy Resident Evil 5 merch for their home avatars. Remember when PlayStation Home was a thing? It's okay, nobody else does either. Number 80. Resident Evil 5 was met with mostly favorable reviews. It currently holds a Metacritic score of 83, and reviewers praised it for amping up the action of 4 and for adding in co-op. However, some critics couldn't help but feel that it didn't really feel like an actual Resident Evil game. Number 81. Despite those mixed reviews, Resident Evil 5 was a huge financial success. Not only is it the highest selling Resident Evil game, but it's also Capcom's highest selling game in the company's history with over 7 million units sold. Number 82. Surprising no one at all, Resident Evil 6's conception came immediately after the release of Resident Evil 5. It began development around 2010. Number 83. Masachika Kawata, who was a producer on Resident Evil 6, stated that the game could take up to 8 years to develop. This was prior to its official announcement that development began in 2010. He also noted that it would be a completely different game from any other entry in the series. Number 84. Producer Yoshiaki Hirabayashi claimed that the Resident Evil series had undergone dramatic changes since the first game, and he wanted 6 to feel like a combination of it all. His hope for the game was to have a balance of everything that players loved, from the horror to the action. Number 85. However, Capcom soon followed up these statements, saying that the horror genre is too small of a market for Resident Evil. This was Capcom's official way of letting fans know that the game would focus more on the action and not play on the horror elements in any serious way. Number 86. The game was led by Hiroyuki Kobayashi, who was an original programmer on the first 2 Resident Evil games. Throughout development, he shared a similar view to Hirabayashi that he wanted to make a game for the fans that they would love. Number 87. Resident Evil 6 features multiple storylines, and all the storylines are also co-op enabled. This is also the first main entry in Resident Evil that features multiple characters you can play as in the same game, like being able to play as both Chris Redfield and Leon Kennedy. Number 88. Hirabayashi wanted zombies in the game from the get-go. He felt that fans had been desperately missing zombies in a main entry of Resident Evil, so he wanted just zombies galore in 6. Number 89. A demo for Resident Evil 6 came out in September 2012 on both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The demo was met with mostly negative feedback when it was first featured at San Diego Comic-Con in 2012, which forced Capcom to change many aspects of the game. Number 90. Upon its release, Resident Evil 6 had a bumpy start. The game officially came out on October 2nd of 2012, but that didn't stop, eager fans in Poland to steal copies of the game before its release and sell them for a high price. Number 91. Resident Evil 6, once it was legally available for purchase, was met with very mixed results. It currently holds a 74 on Metacritic, with reviewers praising it for its fun action. Most of the negative reviewers claimed that the game was just trying to do too much and that it couldn't figure out its identity, and that any sense of horror was in relation to the title of the game, and that's it. Number 92. Despite Resident Evil 6 straying so far from what fans loved of the series, it was still a commercial success. It's currently Capcom's second highest selling game of all time, right behind Resident Evil 5. Number 93. In the wake of Resident Evil 6's reception, Capcom took a long look at the series to figure out where to go next. With the impending Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, Jun Takeuchi came on board again as a producer. He wanted 7 at its core to be what Resident Evil always should be: horror. Number 94. Resident Evil 7 officially began development in February of 2014. An entirely new engine was built for the game named RE Engine, and one of the most unique things about it is that it allows for full VR integration. Number 95. To get fans excited for the game, Capcom released a tech demo to PlayStation's VR headset at E3 2015. The codename for the demo was called Kitchen, and it was meant to serve strictly as a test for VR. However, after such a positive reception for the tech demo, Capcom decided to have Resident Evil 7 be fully playable in VR. Number 96. Resident Evil 7 was officially announced at E3 2016. It was revealed that Koshi Nakanishi, who had worked on Resident Evil Revelations, would be the creative director for this new entry. Number 97. While the game was being designed by the Japanese developer Nakanishi, the narrative direction was being written by a Westerner for the first time in Resident Evil history. And that history maker is Richard Piercy, who wrote 2 of the expansion DLCs for Fear and served as one of the narrative designers for Spec Ops: The Line. Number 98. One of the biggest changes to Resident Evil 7 is that the game will be played entirely in first person, so be sure to have an extra pair of pants on hand if you're going to be playing it in PlayStation VR. Number 99. On June 14th of 2016, almost immediately after the game's announcement, Capcom made a demo available for the game called Resident Evil 7 Beginning Hour Teaser. It was available first to PlayStation Plus members on the PS4. Number 100. The demo would go on to have 2 more chapters added to it. Both of these chapters had new areas that the original demo wouldn't let you enter, and they also had new enemies to hide from. Number 101. Despite all of the added content to the demo, Capcom has stated that the demo is meant to be a standalone experience. Resident Evil 7 itself will feature a different main character than the one playable in the demo, and will have a different story as well. Number 102. A month after its release, it was clear that fans loved playing the demo. It had been downloaded well over 2 million times, and that number continues to grow with its release on the Xbox One. Number 103. Capcom has high hopes for the new Resident Evil and has sales expectations to match that. They're projecting that the game will sell over 4 million copies, which would put it just a little bit above Resident Evil 3's sales, and would have it be one of Capcom's top 10 highest selling games of all time. Number 104. For the hardcore fans out there, Resident Evil 7 does have a collector's edition that is exclusive to GameStop. For a piddly $179.99, fans will get an 8-inch model of the Louisiana house, which also serves as a music box that, when opened, plays Go Tell Aunt Rhody. The collector's edition also comes with a mannequin finger flash drive, a steelbook case, a VHS tape box, a lithograph, and a creepy note. Number 105. One final demo for the game was made public at Gamescom in 2016, and it serves as a real first look for the game's story. The demo isn't playable in any capacity other than to those who were at Gamescom, but there is footage of it online. Number 106. The demo has a found footage vibe to it, just like Beginning Hour does, and it has the player trying to hide from a creepy old lady with a lantern. The lady is later revealed to be Marguerite Baker, who was first referenced in the Beginning Hour. And number 107, Resident Evil 7 was released on January 24th, 2017 on PlayStation 4, PlayStation VR, Xbox One, and PC. Many fans look forward to the game going back to its roots of survival horror and not, well, boulder punching. Thanks for watching 107 Facts about Resident Evil. Have you managed to get your hands on Resident Evil 7 yet? Which game in the series is your favorite? Comment below and let us know. We have new videos dropping every week, so let us know what game you want us to cover next. And if you like getting more from your games, subscribe to the Leaderboard, where we help you game smarter.